Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. We're slowly getting started. We're just waiting for a few more people to join us. I'm Matena Vassilopoulos, and together with my team, Claudia Bodino and Christophe Schrappel, we're delighted to welcome you all today for this new initiative from the Digital Innovation Lab of the European Commission. About the iLab. So the iLab is about exploring, experimenting, and promoting new innovative ways to contribute to the public good and create digital products and services for the public service based on user-centric and co-creation principles to foster multidisciplinary synergies and build networks of communities. We're fairly young, and this is our first public event where we are open to door to people outside of the institutions. We have with us participants from the public sector, the private sector, but also academia and some curious citizens as well. I'd like to highlight that we're looking for new synergies and partnerships and cooperations with existing innovation labs from other institutions, including government, academia, and the private sector. So I really encourage you to get in touch with us if you have something to share or propose. I'll put afterwards in the chat the email address at which you can reach out. Now, regarding the iTalks, as you may know, the European Commission has declared 2023 the European Year of Skills. So with this new series of 6 iTalks, we aim to understand how different stakeholders are addressing the lack of digital skills by looking at concrete use case, initiatives, and challenges from different angles. Today, we're going to learn more about data literacy initiatives from the Open Data Institute, ODI, and public, to organizations that are delivering specific training and initiatives, helping public administration to catch up with data skills. We will have first Tom Pieroni, who's the Senior Trainer and Learning Manager from the Open Data Institute, followed by Thomas Chalk, the Director of Data and AI at Public, and Elina LAM-GALL, the Director of Learning and Workforce Transformation at Public. After each presentation, we invite you to share your questions in the Slido, which you can also find in the chat. And after both presentations, we'll try to open up the floor to a broader discussion where we invite you to raise your hand and we'll be able to basically unmute you, and you will be given the floor to also contribute more verbally to the conversation. So to start, I think I'm going to invite Tom Pieroni to share his screen. Tom, are you with us? Tom, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Sorry, that would have helped if I'd pressed the right button to actually unmute myself. But no, thank you very much. Yeah, my name's Tom Pieroni. I'm from the Open Data Institute. I'm part of the learning team. So much of my role is around working with these different governments, organizations around the world to try and understand where they're at, what are their current capabilities, what are the gaps, and how we can kind of take that forward. And what I'm going to share with you today is the approach that we take and the tools that we have available to us to kind of take this very holistic view on what are data skills, what are data literacies, how do we put in place sustainable programs of development to keep that going. Now, before I tell you anything too much around the ODI and that approach, I just want to kind of start with this this idea. This is an idea from Dr. Jenny Tennyson. Now, she used to be one of the leaders at the ODI and was here for many, many years from the start up until relatively recently. But Jenny's point here is that we need people who can work with the data, but we also need people with the critical skills. Now, there's two sides of this. We've got data skills, data literacies, and if I break it down quite lightly, quite simplified really, what we're looking at is the data skills, the practical application and the practices that we apply to data, and the data literacies. What do we understand from it? How relevant are our interpretations? What do they mean? What can we do about them? Now, when we look at training in data science, we kind of have this kind of piecemeal approach, and it ends up getting a little bit messy in places. And it's messy for kind of understandable reasons. And this is where I'll start to pull in some of the ODI's approach. So at the ODI, we have a theory of change, and it looks a little bit like this. Our central kind of pillar, if you like, is this goal of reaching what we call the farmland. That farmland is where we deliver positive impact. Now, in terms of how you reach that, well, it's all around organizations who make use of data. So are they stewarding data? Are they creating data? Are they making decisions? Are they having outputs? Whatever that might be, it doesn't really matter. Products, services, a new policy. There is something there to deliver positive impact. But in terms of this theory of change, it is all then about balance. Because what happens if we have these data fearing elements? What happens when we have people who aren't confident with data, who don't understand it? What happens if they disengage? Well, we end up in what we call the wasteland. We end up with data sets that are not representative. We don't have the engagement we need. We don't build the trust, and therefore that diminishes our ability to deliver positive impact. On the other side, we have this idea around openness. What happens if people hoard data? It stifles our ability to innovate, stifles our capabilities, and ultimately reduces what we can achieve in the broader infrastructure and the ecosystems that we're looking to build. So the ODI has a mission. That mission is to deliver and work toward a world where data works for everyone. And if we take this on the broad data practices and what we're doing with data, we can also reinterpret this theory of change directly to the data skills and the literacies. So in that data fearing space, are people confident that they have what they need to work with data? Are they confident they are coming out with the accurate insights, but also the appropriate insights? Are they making the right decisions? Are we getting all of our stakeholders involved? Who are we working toward, and do we fully understand the impact of our actions? There's a upskilling point available to us there. And in the data hoarding aspects, then it's around, well, who's getting access to the skills? Are we developing programs that focus on our data specialists? Now, there's not necessarily anything inherently wrong with focusing on our data specialists and upskilling them, but what happens to everybody else? How can we realize the value of data in that kind of broad sense? Now, a couple of years old, few years old, Accenture in 2020, individuals are underprepared for the growing use of data in their roles. And ultimately, again, we can simplify that and we can talk about what happens with data and data use by individuals. And we've got the idea of data as a role, analysts, data scientists, or we've got data in a role, people who are more strategic in their practice. Are they making decisions? Are they looking at the context and what that means for the organization, the sector in which you work, and the outputs that you have? There's two sides, data as a role, data in a role. And ultimately, from the ODI's perspective, we came up with this. This is the data skills framework. And what we've looked to do is actually categorize all of these different areas of data practice, all of these different data skills and literacies, and kind of neatly package them into appropriate areas. Now, it's quite broad, it covers a large area, and it is only a skills framework. I'm not going to sit here and say that we have competencies that sit underneath every single one of these hexes. We have courses that we deliver at the ODI, in which case we have that. But you might take apprenticeship standards, you might take a course that you've curated from a platform that you've got access to, whatever it is. You can start to build out what these hexes mean for you. Now, before I tell you any more about the data skills framework, I just want to kind of pull it back a little bit in terms of the history. So where did it come from? So originally, the work that went into the data skills framework was part of the European Data Science Academy, open data education projects. And the ODI partnered with these different project partners to actually then carry out a large scale research piece. And that research piece, there was over 700 people, there was various different focus group surveys, yada, yada, yada. Lots of work went into it. It was across all different people, different sectors, across higher education, and so on and so forth. But there was two kind of key insights, and initially it's this idea. So managers are consistently more optimistic about their team's skills than the team members themselves. There's a confidence issue here. And is it a confidence issue? Well, in some cases it will be, but in other aspects it'll be a metacognitive issue. Do you actually understand what you know and what you don't? Are you able to identify the gaps in your skills? Are you able to identify your strengths? But in terms of then what those skills might be and what people felt that they needed, data analysis, interpretation, and domain application, critical. Understanding how it applies in your area. Okay, cool. The technical skills, the programming, at the bottom. Now, there's a huge amount of conversation here around, well, everyone should learn to program. And yeah, okay, programming's a good skill and it will help you out in lots of these different areas. But one of the key skills that programming enables you to develop is this idea around your computational skills, your ability to problem solve, your ability to spot patterns, anomalies, and kind of work toward a solution. Programming is a way of developing those skills, but not necessarily the only way. And we've got to kind of be cognizant of that. So a little bit more then on the data skills framework. So where did it come from? Well, it came from all this research. It came from this identification that people aren't entirely sure of what they're good or bad at, and for various reasons. And then we started looking at what kind of skills they were starting to pull through. And we've got the European qualifications framework here, the EQF, and we started to align the work to this. And actually what we found is most of the skills that people are talking about and most of what people need aligns to level 4. In many countries across Europe, this is compulsory education, or it's just after compulsory education. So in the UK, it would be around A level, so just prior to university entry. And actually what we're seeing there then is that a lot of the data skills coming through are things that people have learned before. They just don't really know it yet. And actually one of the biggest problems that we are finding then through this is the lack of attainment in these skills, the lack of confidence in these skills comes down to the application. Do people have the opportunity to take those skills forward and actually apply them to an authentic problem? Now, we've got this idea of problem-based learning. We bring in authenticity in learning. And yes, okay, we could look at opportunities for people to apply it in their work. You've got all the kind of practice words around learning and development, where we've got learning in the flow of work and all that kind of jazz, applied learning, application of learning, whatever kind of wording you want to give to that. But it doesn't necessarily always have to be direct to the job. What we need is the opportunity to put it into practice in a context that is meaningful to the learners. Because a lot of the stuff that they've got and a lot of the stuff that they've learned, they have learned it in the past. They may need a reminder. They may need to cover it again. They may need a simpler explanation. But the thing that's going to pull that forward in somebody's mind in the longer term is the framing, and it's that ability to apply to a problem. Practice-oriented learning methods, that's what we need. So we bring it back to the data skills framework then, and quite clearly what we've done here is start to separate it out. We've got two halves. Foundational data skills, now that's going to be relevant for a lot of people, but we've got these engineering skills and we've got the analysis skills. This is what we kind of set on the side of the practitioner. People who are focused more on the practical skills of working with data. But on the left-hand side, we've got the strategist. So the critical strategic thinking, understanding opportunities, understanding constraints, understanding how all of this work impacts society, understanding how those impacts can then be managed. Doing that balance test of the risk appetite, understanding, is it a net benefit and therefore positive move to go forward? Or is it actually a case of, you know what, we either need to mitigate the issues here massively or scale it back? And it's the ability then to be literate around the insights here to be able to pull it back. In which case then, if we're working through this, do we need experts in data? Or do we need experts in communicating data? Now, this goes back even further. Forbes, forget the data scientist, hire a data translator instead. Is this true? Well, the simplified view of a data scientist. In the middle, we have data science, and we have these three component areas: the problem solving, the ability to interrogate an issue; statistics and maths, the ability to work with the data; the substantive expertise, the knowledge of the domain. So when we pull those three things together, we get data science. But actually, when we're looking at developing skills in and around data, we push these a lot to people who are quite comfortable and confident with data already, in which case then we double down on the statistics and maths, and we double down on the people who are able to solve problems. All of that computational thinking skills comes to light, and we hit this danger zone because it's the lack of the criticality that comes from substantive expertise and the applying of those substantive expertise. In previous years, we would have thought that actually an expert in a subject who can solve a problem is quite dangerous, because what happens if they're not applying the right maths? But the substantive expertise enables you to question, enables you to pull things back should you need to. So the data scientist really doesn't exist without the expertise, but we've still got to work through those data skills and literacies to be critical. So what are they? Well, okay, bit of text on the screen. So there are new technologies, there are new applications. What skills and literacies do we need to maximize the value of data in light of this new context? And I've put the note there. Let's be honest, we're going to talk about generative AI. We'll get it out of the way relatively quickly because it is the hot topic. But does that change the skills? And that's the question I want you to keep in your mind as we move forward. So what is generative AI? It focuses on generating new content. It learns the patterns in the existing data sets. It generates based on that. And that's where we are. But how did we get there? From point A to point GPT? Well, it's been in the works for many, many years. And we've got these 5 waves. Starting in the late 1800s. First wave took a little while. Second wave took a little bit less time. Third wave, a little bit less again. The fourth, a little bit less again. And the fifth, a little bit less again. And actually, when it comes to artificial intelligence, when it comes to all this data practice, it's been going on for years. It's not new. The tools, the contexts may well be new, but the actual practice isn't. And what we're finding now is that we're moving into this next wave, and we've got to ask ourselves is how quick is that wave going to be? So, ChatGPT then, great. 1 million users in 5 days, an immensely quick take-up of a technology. And then we're seeing all of the stats then around what jobs will exist. What roles will we need? Well, we'll need a prompt engineer. Okay, so what is the impact for us? What is the impact of the rise of this role, prompt engineer, that didn't exist a little while ago? Do we need to upskill people in writing prompts? Some people, maybe, yeah. If you want to make use of these technologies, yes, some people will need some skills in and around that. But does everybody? What is the underpinning skill that enables you to write a good prompt? When it comes to tools like generative AI, we're talking about democratization. We're talking about democratization of access, but not representation. The data sets, we've got access to the tools that allow us to manipulate the data sets, but the data sets are not representative. We've got issues with them there. If you think about the public data sets that these tools have been trained on, do they relate to your area of practice? The cultural institutions, the economic institutions, whatever it might be. And ultimately, if we bring that back into the learning sphere, then not everyone needs to learn the new skills, the skills that are now under a different name. But everyone should be given the opportunities to develop the existing skills. So what do I mean by that? Well, let me leave this slide on for just a moment. And what I'd like you to do in your mind is just take this data. There's very little information surrounding this data. But in your mind, draw a trend line, draw a line of best fit, and have a think about where that line ends up. Does it end up at A, B, C, or D? And I imagine the trend lines in your mind probably looked something like one of these. Now, if you think back to that compulsory education, the data skills we were talking about before, the research that we undertook to find out what people needed, well, you've probably seen a lot of these equations before. Linear, it's the equation of a gradient of a line. The quadratic equation, they are covered in compulsory education. It's just understanding the application of these equations. So mathematically correct, but we need to be careful about the contextually correct. So which is the right trend line? Well, this data is actually about the salt concentration of the soil and how it affects a crop yield. With that substantive expertise, we can say that the quadratic equation is the right approach. The quadratic trend line is the correct answer. Mathematically, the other trend lines are correct, but context is super important. I'm sure we've all experienced a data scientist, a data analyst who's gone forward with linear regression. It's a standard practice. It's a good practice. But are we being critical of those outputs? Now, this is a very simple example. When the salt concentration increases, the crop yield exponentially decreases. Quadratic is the right trend line. We've seen the maths before, we just don't have the confidence to apply it. So bringing that back then to the data skills framework, what we have is this core. This is what we call the core. It's where we hang all of our work off. We start with that introduction of data. We cut through what is data. Data is raw material. Data is stuff. And we look at identifying how we want to create value, how we're looking to find our insights, develop our strategies, and ultimately lead the change that we want to see. But how do we do that? The problem solving, the statistics and maths, the substantive expertise, it's all about balance. And this is where we need to be careful, because is one individual going to cover all these three areas? They could, but think about your organization as a whole. We want people to try and cover as much of this as they can. But we need to separate the people from the roles, separate the skills from the roles. And when you're building data literacy, then we don't need to focus on all of these new practices, new technologies, new skills, because the existing skills are still important. They still underpin everything that happens in this new world of practice. So we can focus on the EQF. We can bring in those level 4 aims and outcomes. We can focus on the teaching and learning theory that pushes forward these practice-oriented learning methods. We make it problem-based. We bring in the real-world focus. We have data sets that allow us to manipulate and practice what we're learning. But it's about the balance of practical application and the strategic thought. Okay, cool, I've done some analysis. What does that mean? How do I communicate the message? Data journalism, again, is not a new skill. Florence Nightingale sent back all of the statistics and data around the causes of death for soldiers in Crimea way back when. Build in some interesting visualizations. You've got Jon Snow and the Broad Street water pump looking at cholera outbreaks around London. It's the data skills, the ability to then communicate that message. And the EQF breaks it down for us lovely, in a lovely and simple way. Knowledge, the factual and theoretical knowledge. So what is the context in which you're working? What's the substantive expertise? The skills then to work with the data, the responsibility and autonomy. How do we apply those two things together to be pragmatic, to be accountable, to be critical? So with the data skills framework, then what does it look like when we actually apply it to the building of a course? So this is what the data skills framework covers. Well, this is what we cover in our course, the Introduction to Machine Learning. This is a 3-hour course. It's quite short. It's just to give people an introduction to machine learning. What is the underpinning practice that sits beneath any machine learning algorithm? Now, okay, prior to COVID, a lot of this course would have been delivered in person. we wouldn't have used computers, we wouldn't have used technologies. We would have just done this with a set of cards and some group exercises. Doesn't require any programming, doesn't really require any technology at all. But you can see here the linchpin of this course where we're sitting, finding insight sits at the middle. And we've got the balance between the practitioner skills and the strategic skills. Look at another example. This is our course in strategic data skills. Now it covers much more of the framework. It's a longer course. It's a 10-week course. It looks at data. It looks at how you gather, create data, organize, structure it, clean it, how you create the insights, visualize that data, and how you communicate story. Beyond that, then we're looking at the extra steps into working with live data, APIs, and so on. So across this data skills framework, we're able to pull in all of these different practices. Yes, it's a little weighted toward the skills, but the depth in which we go to with those skills are simply to enable the ability to work strategically. So when you think about your organization, think about all the people that you're working with, think about your stakeholders, the breadth is as important as the depth, and it's separating those roles from the skills so that we upskill people together. Because it's not about the new skills, it's about providing the confidence to apply the stuff that people, by and large, have already covered. So how do you build an effective program? Well, identify the skills that you've got. Review your current approaches. What do you cover? Where are the gaps? Think about how you can improve that. Think about your strategic needs. This is where it's going to be super important. There's the underlying skills, there's the baseline that you might want to bring forward, but think about where you're going. And actually, if you've got lots of people who are interpreting data, are they doing it accurately? Are they doing it appropriately? Data skills, data literacy is what's going to be more important, the strategic side or the practitioner side? So, final thoughts from me then. Separate the role from the skills. I've said it several times, but I'll say it again. Separate the role from the skills. The skills are going to be important across all different types of roles. Think about the opportunities for all levels within your structure. Top to bottom, doesn't matter whether you're senior or junior. The skills are equally as important. Ensure there's the opportunities to apply the learning and do so authentically. If you've got a real world project, great. If you've got a real world practice environment, great. And think about those resources and support. What can you put in place that people can look back on? A workbook, an exercise, whatever it is. Just the support mechanisms to enable people to take that further. I will just do a final shout just to say this data skills framework is openly licensed. It's there to be used. I'll drop the link in the chat so everyone's got it as well, but it comes with guidance on how you might be able to apply it. But thank you very much. My name's Tom, as I say, Tom Pieroni. I'm the Learning Manager at the Open Data Institute. And yeah, welcome any questions.
Thank you very much, Tom, for this great presentation. Very, very insightful, very, very smooth. I really enjoyed listening to you. So I hope our attendees as well. Now we have a short opportunity to ask questions. We will have a dedicated Q&A session at the very end, but maybe you can ask one or two questions directly. If there's someone in the audience who would like to speak as well, then just raise your hand and we will let you open your mic.
I think we have already some questions in the Slido. So just to answer the person asking about the recording and the presentation, if they will be published afterwards, yes, we'll send the recording and the presentation to all the participants. There's also another comment about Tom's presentation, which was excellent, and I couldn't agree any less than that. There's just two questions, Tom, maybe that you would like to answer. Someone is asking you if you could elaborate on separate the role from the skills. Maybe if you want to give a brief answer to that.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, if I take some of the simple skills will be an example that we use quite often is calculating the average. Now, to calculate the average, we need to recognize there's not one average. There's three averages. There's the mean, the median, the mode. Those basic skills are how do you calculate the mean, the median, the mode? Mean, add them all up, divide by the number R, the mode, the most commonly occurring, the median, find the middle. Now that's going to be useful for your people working with data. How do they calculate the right average, the right measure of centrality? But what happens when you get the people who don't work with the data? Do they just ask you to calculate the average? What happens when it's not a normalized data set and therefore the three measures of average are all entirely different? The person making that request is not going to be a data expert. So if we're developing the skills, we want the data analyst to develop the criticality of going, hang on a second, what average, which average? And we want the strategist to develop the data skills to go, I know which average, actually I'd like you to calculate the median. It's a very simple example, but the premise remains the same across the board. So the job title people have is not really important. These skills opportunities and the development opportunities should be available across the board.
Very good. I think that answers it pretty well. There's another one kind of questioning a bit the longevity of the generative AI, and asking how as a public administration do we develop data skills strategies which are not short-sighted, asking not focus on trends such as generative AI.
Yeah, of course. What I'm going to do actually is just put in a web link to a wonderful openly licensed course that looks at a data set. It's r2d3.us. It looks at a data set around machine learning. And it looks at the skills that you apply to machine learning. Now, generative AI, all right, a simplified point, it's a fancy machine learning algorithm. That's what AI is at the moment. It's a fancy machine learning algorithm. So if you're taking these things forward and focusing on the data skills, well, if you're doing automated decision making, what you actually want to do is look at your data sets and identify the principal components, the attributes within those data sets that are most important. You could do that by building a box plot and doing comparisons against the different areas. Building in those data skills, then looking at the strategies, look under the hood. What are the underpinning skills? Some people will benefit from having the super complex AI as a neural network. Most people will benefit from the data skills that enables them to build a decision tree. The premise is very similar. The practice and the application, keep it simple. That's where most people get the most gain.
Yeah, thank you very much also for that answer. I think we're moving on now to our next speaker, and like I said before, we will have a dedicated Q&A session at the very end. So for all attendees, you can still just scan the QR code and ask some questions. So thank you very much again, Tom. And yeah, maybe you can answer some more questions if we have it at the very end.
Yes, perfect. Thank you, Christoph. Now I'd like to ask Thomas Chalk to join us. The floor is yours. Please feel free to share your screen.
That's great. Okay, so before I start, I'll just confirm, can you hear me and can you see my screen?
Yes, all good.
Brilliant, thank you. So I'm here with my colleague Elina, and we're going to be sharing the presentation of the deck. We'll be back and forth between slides. So we're going to explore data skills and initiatives to foster public sector innovation. So how can we increase data literacy at certain levels within the public sector? We'll touch on some of the concepts that Tom shared, but I think it's a distinct presentation. We'll be going more into the details around how to make changes actively happen within government departments to foster the innovation that data literacy provides. So we'll be setting out some core focuses, what it means for the people, the teams, and the roles within organizations. We'll attempt to outline some of the challenges that can occur when embarking upon data literacy innovations within government departments. And Elina will be talking about looking through the lens of user-centered design when developing learning programs as well. We'll also be presenting a couple of case studies at a high level. One will focus on how to upskill a nation with data literacy by including it in a government-wide data strategy. And the other one is more of an organizational level. So how local government can adopt skills to do data better. So as I mentioned, I'm Thomas Chalk, and I'm here with Elina. I'm a director of data and AI at Public. My responsibility within the organization is to deliver data work to our clients, and that's inclusive of the holistic data journey. So it includes learning and development and data literacy programs such as this, but it also flows through architecture, data storage and data analytics, building machine learning algorithms and deploying products. So a bit of everything, really. I'll hand over to Elina, who will introduce herself and run us through the next few slides.
Hi everyone. Yeah, really pleased to be sharing this this talk with you today. So I'm Elina LAM-GALL. I'm Director of Learning and Workforce Transformation and lead all of the kind of integrated cross transformation programs that we run, but we also deliver lots of standalone training programs as well. So in order to explain the perspective that I'm going to offer, it's probably useful for me just to talk a little bit about what Public does. So should we go to the next slide, Thomas? So Public is a digital transformation and advisory agency. We work with public authorities to solve digital challenges. Ultimately, our mission is to really help public sector bodies really transform the services they offer in order to create and deliver a better society for everyone. So we're quite small. We're made up of about 100 designers, project managers, learning and workforce specialists, researchers, and domain and policy experts. We go to the next slide, Thomas. So in terms of learning and workforce transformation, it's the job really of teams like mine to really make sense of how we can, unpack and unlock these really knotty challenges. So ultimately, digital transformation, it really begins and ends with people. And it's our goal to create really sustainable and resilient progress through knowledge and behaviors and cultural change. And really to ask that question, if an organization has that lofty, ambitious digital and data strategy, how do we actually make this work for the people that need to deliver it? How do we enable the culture, the capabilities, the networks and the systems where everyone is really empowered to leverage the transformative opportunities presented by the digital age? So whether we're thinking about universal kind of broader adoption of digital and data practices and skills, whether we're thinking about specialist practitioners, or indeed how leadership enables the willingness and capability for this kind of transformation across a whole organization, our approach is very much, it's human-centered. It's how we democratize those experiences for everybody involved. It's about how we integrate that really exceptional technical expertise that exists with all of this with all these learning and workforce approaches. And ultimately, it's how we eliminate that gap and how we translate the strategy goals into the changes that we want to see across a workforce. So that's really at the heart of really how Thomas and I do this sort of work together and how our teams work together.
Great, thanks, Lena. So I'm just going to briefly go into what is data literacy. And as Tom mentioned in his previous presentation, there can be different interpretations of literacy versus skills. In this presentation, and from my point of view, we're talking about data literacy as a minimum standard of skills that an organization requires to be able to be digital and to use data well. And when I talk about digital and data, I see data as a subcomponent of digital. It is part of it. It's an important part of it. It is the lifeblood by which digital is deployed within organizations. And we believe that the success of an organization in this day and age is driven by having a minimum standard competency when it comes to data and digital. And so there's three components in this diagram on the left. It's the ability to read, write, and communicate with data. And that includes the ability to understand how data goes from being collected and goes through to being used to make a decision, because that's what data is. There's a lot of work that happens in the middle, but really all that data is information on which to base a decision. And the better you're using it, the better you can make decisions. Now, I'm not suggesting that everyone within an organization needs to understand every step on the path to take data from collection through analytics to use, but they need to think in that way. So data in this instance is more of a mindset. It's how can we make our decisions better? And data is often hiding away somewhere within an organization to help you do that. And we need people to think in that way. And that's the most important part of data literacy. As I mentioned, it's a very important part of running an organization in the modern age. There's very few businesses in the world that are not digital in some way, and certainly in the public sector, as we've moved in the past 15 years to full digitization. And some countries are still on that journey, and some are nearing almost full digitization now, but with always area for improvements. Certainly within the sector, it's incredibly important to have this minimum data literacy standard. In a report by Gartner last year, 80% of CDOs and CEOs recognized that data skills were, or digital skills were a block from achieving what they needed to in their corporate and strategic roadmaps. And what we're starting to see now is that data literacy is being recognized at a national level and is being included as pillars within national data strategies, and that there is funding being put across government services, civil services, to make sure that data skills are an important part of an organization's strategic roadmap. We're starting to see less reliance on third-party consultancies being used to deliver data work, and a focus on bringing in full-time employees and upskilling employees that already work within the sector to be able to do this stuff themselves. There's 5 key focuses on here. Now, it's a very busy slide, it's quite wordy, but I'll just talk through the 5 focuses of developing a minimum data standard. So these are 5 things that an organization will need to pay attention to be able to effectively teach data literacy. And these are the 5 things that are quite common focuses across anything, not just data literacy, but setting yourself up as a digital organization. You can see it as a data literacy target operating model approach. So having good infrastructure, as we all know, is incredibly important to the use of data within an organization. Without good data infrastructure, it blocks you from doing anything else further along that value chain. So all of the machine learning and analytics and dashboarding, the stuff that you need to surface the output, has to be underpinned by good data infrastructure. And so it's an understanding of where data is stored, how it is compliant and secure, and how it can be actioned by staff and accessed by staff. People. Tom, in his previous discussion, talked about a role-based approach, splitting skills away from roles, and an understanding of where the data skills need to sit within your organization, and developing a role-based approach to mapping those skills is really, really important. Often organizations have relevant skills within their structure, but they're not necessarily being formed into the right team structure to use them effectively. And so a lens on the people side of things is really, really important, especially if you're going to scale data literacy and have that minimum data standard. Tools as well. So this is not just tools in terms of data tooling. So analytics, for example, Power BI, R, Python. This is tools for learning as well. So knowledge management systems, learning and development platforms that teach data literacy are also very important in terms of tooling. That tooling needs to be inclusive and needs to be consumable and usable at all levels of the business as well. Organizational approach. So organizing your data talent for success, as I mentioned in point 2 around people, you need to organize your data talent into the right structure to get the most out of it. And there's a lot of different team operating models that you can deploy in the digital world. And there's a lot of program management systems you can deploy, such as Agile, Scrum, and then you go into tribes, squads, and guilds. And there's all sorts of different ways to split it, and far too many to discuss in this conversation. But my point is to map how you want data to be used within your organization, to map it to your corporate strategy and your business strategy. You will need to consider how those teams are organized to get the most out of it, and how that learning is shared across those teams. Which brings me on to point 5, which is collaboration is really important when it comes to data literacy. You'll find people take to this way of thinking very quickly, but there'll be others who will take time to catch up. And the best way to bring everyone up at the same time, to the same level at the right time, is to drive collaboration and establish processes by which people can share their thoughts, learnings, and ideas across the business. And you can do that via things like communities of practice, which I'll come on to in a later slide. So if you were going to embark upon trying to improve data literacy within your organization, the first thing that we would recommend doing is getting an understanding of where you are today. Conduct a maturity assessment. And there are frameworks and methodologies to do this in a more granular way. But on this slide, I'll just cover the 5 kind of core questions that you could ask yourself if you were a senior digital leader and you needed to understand where your organization is at. Now, some of these questions may seem quite specific, but they're actually quite good ones to get under the skin of where the problems lie within the organization. So things like how many people know where and how to get data to analyze, which is problem number 1. As someone who's been a data scientist, there's no more of a common problem than actually not just being able to get hands-on data. The modeling is easy. It's getting data that's consumable by your model that's tricky. So do people in the organization have an awareness of where it is? How many of your managers understand how to link data project to the data value it delivers? Tom in his previous presentation talked about data translators, which was a term brought in around 5 years ago. I think McKinsey coined it, but it's the ability to tell a story around data, not just being able to process it and use it and analyze it, but a communication to the wider stakeholders in the business of how valuable it is. That's really important too. So having managers that can do that is important. How many people can develop the right analyses? So how many people have got that analytical skill set to deploy the right models at the right time? How many people can interpret and explain analytics output? So also really important, and something that goes beyond being an analyst and a data scientist. There are other people within the organization that should have the ability to interpret a dashboard or interpret the output of a model, perhaps. And how many people can use data tools? This is something that I've noticed throughout my career as a perennial problem, especially when organizations take on third-party tooling. They buy things off the shelf, and moving into the cloud makes it infinitely easier just to keep ordering different tools and technologies. But the organization does not train the people in the correct use of the tool, and that leads to much less value being delivered. So often I'll go into organizations and they'll have the right tool stack, but they don't have the skill sets to use them effectively. So it can lead to a lot of lost money and a lot of lost value. So those are the 5 key questions to get your finger on the pulse of data literacy. So what can organizations do after they've asked themselves some key questions and understood their current maturity? An objective-driven approach is really, really important. If you're going to stand up initiatives to increase data literacy and get your team structure correct, measuring it is very, very important. So setting solid objectives and outcomes about what you want to achieve is paramount. Not all organizations are built the same. Different organizations have different goals, different business goals, different corporate goals. So a solid alignment to strategy and establishment of outcomes is important, but also define some KPIs to measure the success of your learning programs. Number two, ensure training is applied and offers opportunities for staff to put it into practice. That's really important, especially with data skills. It's if you don't use it, you'll lose it, is what I say. I know that I've probably gained and lost many data skills over the years since my career has morphed away from being an applied statistician and data scientist. But even if you're teaching people the minimum data standard, where they simply need to understand how data flows through organizations, give them an opportunity to use that. Put them on data projects, start data initiatives, make the projects around this literacy improvement program so that people can really get to grips with it. And then that learning sinks in forever. Point three, create continuous feedback loops. And so employees can iterate the training. So not all training programs will work from the off. Your teams will react in different ways. You'll have different learning personas on the teams. And so being able to personalize training as much as you can is really, really important. And there's really good ways to do that nowadays. I'm sure Elina will come on to that. But having this continuous feedback loop to tweak training is really, really important. And you do that by looking at the metrics continuously. And underpinning all three of these things that organizations can do, there's some methodologies so you can maximize the value. As I said before, setting up communities of practice is a really good way of doing it. It's uncommon that you would have a large organization that has a single data unit within it, and those are the people that do the data and only them. Often data skills and people who work in a data context are spread out throughout an organization. So bringing them together through an informal community of practice is a really good way of keeping them in touch with each other, to offer collaboration and to offer shared experiences and learning. Having learning use case libraries, so an online organizational intranet where you've got libraries of learning materials and different learning use cases is really important. And that should be communicated via the community of practice. And experts as well. So within your organization, identify who are your data leaders and data experts and have them steering your data literacy programs. It's okay that the idea of data literacy improvement comes from the top, CEO or director level, but there will be people within your organization who have more of an ear to the ground when it comes to data and the types of learner value cases that you can get from it, and have those people in a senior position within these programs. So I've got a couple of case study slides here now before I pass over to Elina. The first one talks about upskilling a nation, and it talks about how the UK government have placed importance on data literacy and have included it in part of their national data strategy. The second one talks about a more sort of magnified scope use case where our Office of National Statistics have offered learning programs to local government analysts. But just to talk about this briefly, the UK government released its data strategy a couple of years ago. Within it is a pillar that focuses on data literacy. And it focuses on data literacy from the point of view of upskilling the public as a whole, as it recognizes that the country will become more digital skills based, and the country is keen to become a shining example of good digital and data use and AI use on the world stage. But it also recognizes that its employees as a government, one of the biggest employees in the nation, needs those digital skills internally to help citizen services run more efficiently. So the reason it's included a pillar within its national strategy is because it recognizes that it has an impact on the wider economy, as mentioned. We have an increasingly digital economy with businesses being digitally based. It wants to lead by example, and as part of the strategy, it is providing support, and it collaborates with other arm's length bodies and businesses to be able to develop programs and skills and provide funding for data literacy. As mentioned, the government is a major employer in its own right and wants to enable its workforce to be more digital, more data driven. And it recognises that data literacy has an important role in society as well as the economy, and it wants to support individual citizens and groups to play an active role in our increasingly data-dominated world. Giving people the skills that they need to thrive and have solid careers and lives within an increasingly data-driven and digitally driven world. This is the example case study of how we're not talking at a national level now, but at a lower level and upskilling an organisation. So our Office of National Statistics in the UK have provided training, online training via the Data Science Campus for local government analysts. So there's always been a challenge to finding excellent data skills within public sector en masse. Obviously, there are hundreds of thousands of data analysts that work in any government body at any one time, but finding skill sets en masse can be tricky when trying to fight off private sector organizations who tend to hire a lot of data scientists and data analysts as well. So there is a skills gap shortage. I'd say that's fairly recognizable in the UK, but improving. And to provide meaningful training at the local government level, which does struggle most to set up data science capacity, is really, really important. Hence why this data science campus exists. So it helps local government analysts build additional skills and venture into the world of machine learning methods and practices, and also using the types of tools that you need to build those types of models. And it focuses on several introductory pathways, as bullet pointed there, around being aware of analytics, being able to communicate, how to get data, make sure it's of sufficient quality, and then managing it correctly, as well as some quite commonly used models such as time series analysis. And then there's some additional learning pathways that are more complex, such as data linkage, visualization, onto predictive analytics and statistical analysis. And this is a really important example that I think we can take the core message from and keep in mind, is that rather than having a reliance on bringing in external people such as consultancies or hiring new people with a skills gap or skills shortage ongoing, we need to identify people within our organizations who already have some data skills and have a need or a want to learn more. And the provision of these types of online training programs to upskill local government analysts is a really, really good way of doing that. And you're able to turn someone who's been an analyst for 1 year into a data scientist in a very short amount of time, which can add massive value to an organization. So upskilling within government, I think, is the way to go. I'm going to hand over to Elina now. We'll talk a little bit about our internal public school of technology approach to learning.
Brilliant. Thanks, Thomas. Yeah, so I'm really going to, I think, really build on some of what Tom flagged in the previous talk, and also what Thomas has been talking about in that kind of slightly more holistic view of how we approach upskilling and the programs that need to sit around the upskilling. So I think the first thing, from a perspective of learning and workforce specialists, is data doesn't exist in isolation. It sits within a context, it sits within someone's everyday work, the problems they're trying to solve, and that sort of thing. So I think when we think about that, we want to think about a holistic, people-centered, whole organizational approach to how we drive this kind of change and transformation. If you can just keep clicking through, thanks. So we have these 3 tiers. So we have a universal tier, which I think Thomas has kind of touched on, and actually Tom also did in the previous talk, about this, this minimum operating standard. What are those key concepts and skills required for data literacy in your context? And this is about building capability definitely from the ground up. And then we've got this practitioner tier. So this is about, well, referring to these capabilities and experts within the org that Thomas was just talking about, thinking about how we can empower our practitioner level people, our more specialist people, to really think about how they're innovating using data beyond their sort of individual work, but also beyond their teams as well. And then we have this third strategic tier, which really needs to think about, the leaders need to, within organizations, thinking about how they can enable the conditions for success in data transformation and innovation across their whole organizations, across their teams. So this doesn't have to be your most senior leaders. This can be any level of leader of a small team, a bigger team, you know, a workspace, a whole organization. So we're thinking about all of those sorts of leaders. And really, they need to be tackling those knotty challenges around the culture, the behaviors, you know, thinking about how people collaborate. And I just want to add a couple more points before I hand back to Thomas. Just talk a little bit. He's going to talk a little bit more about what this means in practice in relation to data. But I think when we think about data upskilling, we think about digital upskilling, which is something, you know, I talk about. These are very, very broad ideas, and I think what we also need to be thinking really carefully about is how we are training and equipping our people. It doesn't matter how, you know, lower level or higher level or whatever that, you know, their job is or their job requirements are. How are we equipping them to be able to problem solve and to use data in order to problem solve, right? So we need to think about other kinds of training that people really need in terms of ways of working and ways of approaching their work, right? So we need to think about things like user research, problem identification. We need to think about you know, collaborative approaches, ways to work with, you know, multidisciplinary teams, ways to affect decision making, to really push the boundaries of how, in this context, how we might use data to really transform and innovate the way we work, how to create, you know, and develop prototypes, which is really just a testable solution that can be tried out. And then obviously, you know, it's thinking about all of that in the context of the broader problems that they're trying to solve. So I think that's the first sort of additional point that I wanted to make. And then the other thing, which I think Thomas has touched on, but which I really want to echo, which is just so important, is that any transformation initiative is going to fall down if it doesn't have a proper program around the people. So Thomas mentioned communities of practice. He mentioned use case libraries. I want to, you know, build on that even more and say that, you know, who is coordinating the kind of the center of excellence around this within a smaller organization, within a bigger team, organization, whatever, who owns the way that this is being done, and who is going to, you know, keep that knowledge and manage that knowledge and make sure that it's disseminated across the organization. Who are your champions? So that's sort of referring back to Thomas's mention of experts as well. And how are we, you know, once someone's done their upskilling, what supports are in place to actually make sure that this training really sticks, and that whatever we're doing, all these efforts we're making are really translating into the changes that we want to and really need to see within our workforces. So yeah, so it's the other kind of upskilling that needs to sit around, you know, in this context, data upskilling, but also thinking about the programs around people. Thomas, go for it.
Brilliant. Yeah. So this slide very much maps to Elina's slide there, where we're talking about three-tiered approach. So Elina focused on a three-tiered approach to learning. I'd like to contextualize that within the data setting. And we've already picked up on a few of these points already, so this should be fairly easy to get my point across here. So as said, our foundational tier, developing a common data skills standard or a common operational standard, bringing all staff up to a minimum standard by embedding mandatory trainings into their learning journey. So when staff join your organization, there should be a focus on mandatory training around how to think in terms of data, how to link data to solving problems, how to deliver output on which you can make decisions. And as mentioned, it doesn't need to be a complex understanding of how data sits within the cloud or how to build a model. It's simply a way of thinking in terms of how can we enable data access, how can we encourage a culture around data sharing, and how can we bring people up with the basic levels of skills to understand data. And sometimes that can be based in the simplest of tools, such as Excel, thinking in terms of rows and columns and how to link that type of data to output. And I would say as well, it doesn't have to be everyone in your organization that has this, but we should be targeting 80% of staff to have these types of skills, especially in the public sector, where there is an emphasis on the professional digital working environment. The practitioner tier is more specific skills based. So these are people who work actively within data roles. They are analysts, scientists, engineers, cloud engineers, and they need a role-based approach to delivery of these skills. So this is not mandatory training, but there should be clear learning and development pathways within your organizations for these people to get the skills they need to do their job. And these skills are dependent on a few things. They're dependent on their role and their responsibilities of that role. They're also dependent on the types of technology that are chosen for them to use. If you are, for example, an adopter of Microsoft Azure and you prefer Power BI and you want to use Databricks within that cloud setting, then your practitioners should have the skills they need to do that. And you may choose to hire based on those skills. But if you're bringing in new technologies, there needs to be a learning pattern associated with the use of that technology to make sure that those people are getting what they need to do their jobs efficiently. And then there's a strategic leadership tier, and everything that I've discussed so far is really underpinned by this. So there has to be a top-down approach to the promotion of structured learning and development pathways and increasing data literacy within the organization. And none of that happens without the leaders at the top understanding the importance of data and putting sponsorship and funding around programs within the organization to make it happen. There needs to be a focus on digitization, and there needs to be a focus on using data effectively. And embedding that culture definitely comes from the top. And even at the top of organizations, those people can require that understanding and that learning. And that's something we do at Public, is we teach at the highest levels within government how to use data effectively and how to foster that innovation and data culture. And I believe that's the end of the presentation. So yeah, I'm Thomas Chort, Director of Data and AI. And we've had Elina as well, and we're welcoming questions.
Thank you very much, Thomas and Elina, for the great presentation. Thank you so much for bringing some nuance to the topic and splitting really what it means to have data skills and data literacy. So thanks a lot. Now we're going to open the floor again for some questions, and we already have some in the Slido. But yeah, I want to emphasize again that if you want to speak up, please just raise your hand and we're going to unmute you. So you also have the possibility to speak. And now I will share the questions on Slido again. So one was, you mentioned the communities of practice. Do you have any concrete examples to share?
I can name some examples of how I did it at my last organization, which it wasn't public sector specific, but the rules still apply. And when I emphasized the point in my presentation around how it'll be rare to have a single data team in the business, this is where that really applied. So I was working for a very large organization of 35,000 people across the globe. And there was an emphasis on digitization over the past 5 years, and there was a very solid strategy in place. And there was an emphasis on sharing data ideas, methodologies in order to upskill as one, rather than having pockets of data being done well in certain geographies and not in others. And this community of practice, the mechanisms of getting there are actually pretty simplistic. It's identification of where these skills and people sit within the business is number one, which can be tricky in large organizations. But speaking to senior leaders helps get an understanding of where these people are and where the interested parties lie. And bringing people together via regular governance touch points every month, every 2 weeks, or circling people around different learning initiatives by putting out trainings that people can discuss and enjoy is important. But Most simply, using internal communication tools to create these groups of people is often the best way of doing this. So using Microsoft Teams or Slack or wherever you have this internal communication tool to gather these people together, and then putting some organization around it is really, really important. You're just trying to create sort of a safe space for like-minded people to share interesting thoughts and ideas. That's really at the heart of this. And so that's the heart of a community of practice. And of course, you can add things to that. You can add document libraries and training and development plans to underpin it all and help with structure and process. But I think the first thing to focus on is just getting like-minded people together.
Thank you very much. There's two questions that are somewhat related. I'm going to read them. So the first would be, what would your assessment in terms of composition of data-related roles in an organization, and which are the key roles and their numbers in terms of positions? And there's another one which is kind of connected to that, because it is about, as a public administration, we do not have the necessary digital data skills, rely on external consultants, how to decide which skills should be in-house. So maybe if anyone wants to answer that, please feel free. Also, Tom, if you're also invited to answer.
Thomas, do you want to kick off on that? Because I've definitely got some thoughts, but if you probably go first, or if Tom Pieroni, if you want to go first.
I'll have a quick stab at the composition of data-related roles, which is something I've done a bit over the years in terms of digital transformation work and kind of digital target operating model. The composition of data-related roles in an organization depends on many things. There is no one-size-fits-all approach. It has to map to the different strategies that exist in the organization. So when I've gone in and I've done data transformation work for organizations, you can't do it in isolation. You have to map it firstly to your IT strategy, and then the IT strategy needs to map to your corporate strategy. So there needs to be a firm understanding of where your business wants to travel to, or where your government department wants to travel to. What are your goals for the year? What do you need to do? And that then drives IT decisions, which in turn drives data decisions. And then you will structure your teams around those goals. But if I was to speak very loosely, you need teams that focus on four things. Number one, data engineering, so the ability to move data around. Number two, data analytics, so building statistical models and machine learning. Team number three, business intelligence and dashboarding, to give business as usual intelligence for use. And number four, a team that focuses around solution design and translation. And those are the people that can turn what the other three teams create into usable and valuable material within the organization. That's the way we tend to structure data consultancies, but it's also a model that works really well in any other organizations. But the scale of those teams is very much dependent on the size of your organization and what you want to go after. So not every organization has to do artificial intelligence and machine learning. Let's get that straight. No matter what the media tell you, it's not always important. So you may want to scale down that team in favor of data engineering, because you may be at a maturity level where you need to move your data into the right place right now. So an emphasis on engineering rather than data science is important. So yeah, I hope that was helpful, but it's not a clearly answered question.
If I can just build on that. So I think I love this person's comment just at the top of the Slido here, which is, where do you start? We don't even know what we don't know. I think that is such an important point, and that's why, you know, a really good, in this context, data-oriented but learning and workforce discovery is a really, really critical first step. And I think it's really important to see this as, you know, Thomas mentioned there a year, and, you know, where does the business want to travel? But I would actually see all of this kind of innovation and transformation in this context as a longer roadmap to increase capability within an organization over time. And I think that the we don't know what we don't know thing is that's a phrase that I say quite a lot, because you need a combination of different integrated specialists to come in and have a look at what exactly that level of maturity that Thomas just mentioned, and enable and empower your organization to make the right decisions for your organization right now. And then also think about the upskilling that's needed, think about the programs around the people that are needed, but then to think about, okay, well, in a year, where do we want to be? and in 2 years, where do we want, and then a longer roadmap. And then that can be iterated and it can be flexed throughout, because you don't have to stick to these sorts of things stringently. But I think it is really important to think about, like, well, if we don't know what we don't know, how we can find that out and who is going to help us to do that. Because certainly when Thomas and I think about, we've worked in the public sector or with the public sector for our whole career, pretty much our whole careers at different points. And we are in the business of thinking about how we can empower organizations to do things for themselves. Because there will be another thing that comes down the road. It's data, it's LLMs at the moment, whatever it is, but there'll be other things that we need to help people with. So we want to make sure that everyone gets to not just up to speed, but kind of a foot in the future when it comes to things like data and digital technologies that exist right now. So I think, I would say that it's about that, really underpinned by that proper discovery about the current as-is picture of the organization.
Yeah, thank you so much for this extensive answer. So there's one question, and again, please, Tom, anyone who participates, please feel free to answer that. Why ODI has such a strong emphasis on open data? A lot of data which is relevant to us is not actually open data.
Yeah, so why is it important? It's in the name, so that kind of is a driving factor of it. But ultimately, when it comes to this idea around open data, what the ODI is working toward, and it comes back to this mission, a world where data works for everyone. And what we're essentially seeking to do is this trustworthy data ecosystem. So if we look around the benefits of open data, the high level stuff is largely around participation. It's that element of representation within the data. So if you take kind of, big data as a bit of a buzzword and break it down to how you describe and define big data, you do it with words that only begin with V. So volume, how much, variety, how representative is it, veracity, what's the data quality like? Is it any good? Now, with those things in mind, when you've got kind of this idea of data hoarding, so the theory of change that I spoke around, and people taking all of that and holding it close to their chest and essentially having it as closed data, it stifles the broader innovation point. So why is the emphasis on open data? Well, we're looking at what data can provide us. By sharing the data, by sharing data more broadly, then we can increase the quality of public services. We increase the participation that goes into the data sets that inform our public services. There's the cost saving initiatives where do we need to create data that somebody else has already done? Do we need to engage in activities that develop processes, practices, products and services that somebody else is doing better? One of the best examples that I can think of that really kind of hammers home the point of open data and the benefits more broadly is Transport for London. So the last report that was published around Transport for London and their open data was in 2017. The comprehensive review that came through then basically said, well, it costs Transport for London £1 million a year to publish the data. The benefit to the economy around them, so applications like Citymapper, Google Maps, smaller applications with more nuanced users, real-time trains and Station Master, the benefit economically, 130 million. £1 million cost, 130 million benefit to the local economy. The cost savings to TfL on not having to provide the services that all of these new apps provide was 4 million. So immediately, Transport for London brought in £3 million, but the benefit to the economy, 130 million. That's just off the sharing of data, and that was as of 2017. Now, I'm not going to say all data needs to be open. We do actually, although we are the Open Data Institute, we do talk about the balance. Obviously, there's things like personal data, and then you get in the GDPR and data protection discussion. There are things that don't necessarily need to be shared, but we tend to refer to it as data existing on a spectrum from closed to open, and there are the stages in between that as well.
Thank you very much for this great example. If the other speakers, if you have anything to add, please feel free to add.
Yeah, just to comment on Tom's point there, because I'm very much a fan of open data sharing. As I previously mentioned, being a data scientist, it's all about getting your hands on good data to do cool things with. And I think over the past 5 years, we've seen an increase in open data sharing, partly because organizations are finally organized enough to get their data in a way that they can share it, but also cultural barriers internally are being broken down. If we think back to COVID and the amount of open data that was shared globally on COVID data, COVID statistics, the only way that we could create those vaccines that fast was because of that data sharing by agencies globally, and AWS setting up the great cloud structure for people to do it. It was a reaction, and it's evident the benefit that these things have. And I understand that some organizations, the data that they need isn't available, but I would also encourage organizations to go and seek open data sources, because actually there's a lot of open data out there and it's not often well communicated. Even me, who works in public sector and government, wasn't aware that people like the Greater London Authority have a website full of brilliant data around transport and air quality, and they put it out there for it to be used. And they said to me in an innovation day a few weeks ago, no one's using it. So take some time internally to put people out researching for these open data sources, and I think you'll really find some useful stuff out there.
Great. Very good. So now since we're running out of time, the last chance for the attendees. If you want to speak up, please raise your hand. If this is not the case, I will hand over to my colleague Athena. So if you have some closing remarks, also to the speakers, please feel free to do so. If not, we're going to wrap it up here.
I think one more question entered in the Slido, Christoph, but I'm not sure.
Yes, there's just one slide in the last minute. So what would be the basic toolbox that would be needed for reaching a basic data skill level in-house, assuming the more technical part has been fixed?
I'll jump on that
Yes, please.
initially, and maybe there'll be some follow-up comments. But I think, as I mentioned, alignment to strategy is really important. Set yourself a data maturity roadmap. Where are you today versus where you want to be? Do you want to do better business intelligence? Do you want to do better machine learning? What are your use cases? Okay, so define your use cases, define your value case against those, i.e., is that use case going to be valuable to us? And then only once you understand the use cases can you define your skill sets. And you need data solutions people to understand the mechanisms of how that happens. So if you say that, I don't know, I want to predict people's ability to pay back debt, you understand the use case, you understand the value it's going to bring, and then you need to understand what data do I need to get there, and what types of models do I need to build. So you need to go down to that granular level. And once you represent these use cases across your business, say you collect together 20 that you want to tackle during 2023, you can then align your skill sets to it. Okay, but focus on having a really good engineering team. Getting data out of systems is critical, but then also focus on having a really good analyst team as well. But don't forget this idea behind this data translator. So something that will prevent you from building a data science team effectively within an organization is funding and sponsorship from the people who have the money within the organization. If you show them something you've built that is valuable and you communicate it well, they will listen, and then they will give you the skills that you need to build something bigger and better. Yeah, effective communication is key.
Thank you very much. So
Yes, I think if there are no more comments, we will close this second session of our iTalk series. I've shared in the chat, and as you can see on the slide, we invite you to subscribe to our Join Up page, and of course to register for the upcoming sessions of the iTalks. We also invite you to share your feedback from this session and to let us know if you'd like to collaborate in the future. We're very open to this. In the meantime, I'd like to thank again our speakers. So Tom Pieroni from ODI, Thomas Chalk, and Elina LAM-GALL from Public for their inspiring presentations, and of course to my colleague Maria Claudia Bodino and Christoph Schrappel for their great support. So yes, thank you for participating to the session, and we hope to see you in the next ones.
Yeah, so yeah, thank you very much. As well from my side, I saw Maria Claudia has also joined. So yeah.
Thank you. Thanks again, and thanks also for the speakers and for my colleagues. Thanks a lot. It was a great session.
Great.
See you soon.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for your participation. Thanks. Bye-bye.